Jon Snow sat alone in the great hall of the Red Keep, the marble floor gleaming beneath the flickering torchlight. His black cloak draped over the Iron Throne steps, a fading echo of the Night's Watch vows he had once tried so desperately to uphold. The Iron Throne loomed behind him, wrought of 1,000 melted swords and centuries of ambition. Now, as the newly crowned king in Westeros, he was a man who had disavowed that ambition for so long, but found himself chained by the crown all the same. No banners adorned the hall except the pale gray banner he had taken to using in these last weeks. A simple field with a single white direwolf's head in its center, an unmistakable emblem of House Stark, though the name Stark was now spoken in hushed tones, if at all. He listened to the uneven drumbeat of his heart, measured in the same careful way he had always navigated life's tribulations. In the quietude that preceded dawn, Jon Snow reflected on what had brought him to this moment. The swirl of betrayals, the cost of war, the clamor of thousands who proclaimed him a hero after the long night, and the final, unspeakable betrayals that had made him renounce half of his loyalties and reinforce the other half to the bitter end. Too many times he had sacrificed, too many times his trust had been misplaced. The result was a man both hardened and haunted, perched upon the seat of ultimate power he had never sought, but had taken in a moment of desperate necessity. It had begun with chaos, as these things often do. The final days of Daenerys Targaryen's reign and her hold on King's Landing crumbling into ash. In the aftermath, the lords of Westeros had argued, fractured, and thrown their support behind any of a dozen claimants. Yet Jon had emerged as a unifying force, the reluctant hero who had slain the Night King beyond the bitter winds of the north. Over many months, armies broke themselves upon each other. Small folk starved or fled. Fewer lords remained to shape the realm's future. In desperation, or perhaps cunning insight, the lords who survived crowned Jon as their king, the White Wolf who defied death. They called him an echo of Azor Ahai. But the crown came with an avalanche of feuding houses, each vying for new privileges and old enmities. In the swirl of renewed politics, fresh blood was spilled for ancient grudges. The fracturing began anew. Jon stood watch over the realm's dissolution, a single man forced to bear the full weight of centuries-old divisions. Day after day, hearing after hearing, he was confronted by entreaties, the Lannisters wanting their gold shipments uninterrupted, the Tyrell loyalists or what was left of them clamoring for restitution after the sack of Highgarden, the Greyjoys petitioning for independence upon the seas, the Baratheons, dwindled though they were, demanding recognition of their valiancy in the final battles. Coupled with these ceaseless demands were the smaller lords, the minor houses, each with a complaint about farmland, river rights, or cattle stolen from the next hamlet over. It was Tyrion Lannister, once hand to a dragon queen, who confided in Jon how the Seven Kingdoms had shaped themselves into a hydra of grievances. "Trim one's ambition, and 2 more will replace it," he said with a grim smile. Jon, feeling adrift, had asked Tyrion what might truly bring peace. But Tyrion, renowned for wit and cunning, looked as lost as Jon felt. In the end, it was ironically Sansa's unwavering realism that gave Jon the impetus for the final, dramatic action. She had governed the North with a careful hand, but confronted him with a harsh truth. "The realm does not want peace, Jon," she had said quietly. "The realm wants advantage, and it is only the peace they profess to want that lulls their enemies so they can rise again stronger." The knowledge had churned in Jon's mind for many sleepless nights, after a particularly brutal riot in the streets of King's Landing, where small folk died in droves, outraged by corrupt tax collectors acting in the name of noble factions. Jon returned to the Red Keep spattered with dust and dried blood. A few days later, the Crown announced something unprecedented, an official decree that changed the face of Westeros. In the name of King Jon Targaryen Stark, for some still insisted that was his rightful style, though he rarely used it, all great houses were stripped of their titles and exiled from the Seven Kingdoms. The lesser houses followed. Every lord, lady, and recognized member of the nobility was given 1 month to leave Westeros or face immediate execution. Their lands, their keeps, and their privileges all dissolved under the newly minted directive of the king. For the king had declared the realm no longer belonged to the scions of the past but to its people, the living men and women and children who had borne the brunt of centuries of war. They called him the Wolf King after that. Whispered rumors said madness ran in his Targaryen blood. Others claimed heartbreak had hardened his heart like northern ice. Few truly grasped what it cost him, the day he declared that the old families must go. Fewer still believed he had the power or the will to enforce it. Yet enforce it he did, slowly and systematically. Soldiers loyal to Jon's cause patrolled the roads, read the king's proclamations to the towns and castles, oversaw the entire diaspora of noble blood from the corners of Dorne to the storm-battered shores of the Iron Islands. Those who refused to relinquish their hereditary seats were soon cast from them, either by threat of arms or swift brutality. The Watchers in the north, startled to see their own Lady of Winterfell forced to depart, realized Jon's decree was absolute. Even Sansa, who had tried to appeal to him on behalf of the Starks who were left, found that Jon would not relent. "There is no easy way, Sansa," he had told her. "I've tried half measures. I've tried to trust the houses, and each time, the realm bleeds anew." He had embraced her before she left for the ships at White Harbor, tears streaming down both their faces. Yet she had felt, in his arms, a distant numbness that made him tremble as though he faced a monstrous truth. He whispered in her ear, "I love you," an apology for the unimaginable finality of his decision. Then Sansa was gone, tears still glittering on her cheeks, banished along with the last of the noble line she had fought so hard to preserve. So began the new era. The Wolf King sat upon the Iron Throne with an expression perpetually caught between regret and steeled resolve. In the back of his mind, the memory of his father's, his supposed father Ned Stark's, execution reverberated. He remembered the scars left behind by every betrayal from the moment he joined the Night's Watch. All the ancient laws and intangible codes of honor that had served as pretenses for war after war crumbled under the unstoppable wave of the king's edict. The soldiers, sworn newly to the crown, wore plain surcoats with the White Wolf sigil. There were no more Lannisters, no more Martells, no more Tullis. If any of these exiled lords remained in Westeros, they were in hiding. On the 50th day after the decree, in the second moon of Jon's reign, King's Landing stood eerily calm. Thousands of the city's inhabitants, once suspicious of any new regime, discovered that certain freedoms emerged from the absence of those old houses. But with those freedoms came a new sort of oppression. A singular will, that of the king, maintained by a lesser number of newly formed Crownsguard. By the time the last Lannister ship had been seen sailing west, by the time dawn broke over an emptied Highgarden, rumors were told in hushed voices. The king had driven out all challengers to the throne, all potential pretenders, all possible seeds of civil war. Yet the realm, under its veneer of order, simmered. The small folk in remote villages saw their everyday troubles go largely ignored by a newly centralized power in King's Landing that was still finding its footing. Although farmland that had once belonged to proud lords or ladies was now declared crown property, distributed at will, confusion reigned on the local level. Who was in charge of collecting the harvest? Who oversaw justice in the villages? Constables and bailiffs, appointed by the new king's central authority, were often at a loss for how to handle the complexities once overseen by lesser lords. In many places, corruption seeped back in under new faces, functionaries, mercenaries, or city-born bureaucrats who had no meaningful tie to the communities they governed. The Wolf King tried to juggle 1,000 tasks in a single day, far worse than even the simplest illusions he'd once entertained about ruling. He set out to reorganize the realm in a radically new shape, one where each major region would send representatives chosen by the people themselves, by the blacksmiths, the farmers, the weavers, and the innkeepers. Jon's dream, spoken only to a few confidants, was for a realm that recognized no hierarchy of blood but the leadership of proven worth. Yet dream and reality clashed. On the mornings that Jon walked among the common folk, he would see the confusion and fear in their eyes. Many recognized him as a man of once humble station, the bastard of the north, and those he spoke to found him gentle, reluctant in his bearing. But behind him at every step were the unsmiling Crownsguard, hand-picked by Jon for their loyalty and skill. Men and women who had once fought in the War of the Long Night, or those who had grown up despising the old houses for personal reasons, or some who believed in the Wolf King's vision of a wholly new Westeros. Jon, in his quieter moments, knew that this measure, banishing all noble houses, was a short-term solution. He had removed the heads of the beast, but he felt new ones forming in the shape of cunning bureaucrats and sly power-seekers. Even so, he held firm to the letter of his decree. The aristocracy, with its lineages and titles, was gone. His nights were sleepless, haunted by the faces of those he'd banished. He thought of Sansa often, picturing her with an exiled retinue sailing to Bravos or perhaps northward still, if that was even possible. Arya, too, had left the continent by sea before the decree was fully enforced, presumably off to find some new frontier. Bran, who had once been chosen king in certain visions of the future, had retreated into the vastness of the north and beyond, leaving no message for his brother. Tyrion had already fled, using ships in Old Town that bore no banner. Samwell Tarly was forced to leave as well, though he parted with an anguished look, telling Jon that the Citadel's knowledge might be threatened if the Maesters were forced from their ancestral seats. Jon had not known how to respond to that. The Tarly name was among the noble lines, though Sam had turned Maester in all but name. And Gilly, Jon shivered to think how she must have looked at him, seeing the man who was once her friend, now her judge. Even Ser Davos Seaworth, once the Onion Knight, had eventually found the king's new demands too harsh. In the end, Davos chose exile rather than stand by the throne with blood on its edges. And so, lonely, Jon walked the halls of the Red Keep, which had become emptier than ever. Queen Cersei had died in the wars before his ascension. The Targaryen queen was gone as well, and so many others. The tapestry of houses had vanished, replaced by a stark emptiness. Jon found himself drifting off into the castle walls to gaze over King's Landing, a city that no longer roiled with open factional strife, but seemed to brood under the knowledge that only one man held all power. One night, after a weary day of hearing petitions, Jon settled in the king's solar. A small fire crackled in the hearth. He looked at the table strewn with parchments. Each scroll was a request from a region: farmland distribution, justice appointments, trade route establishment. As he glanced over them in frustration, Ghost padded silently into the room, the great white direwolf still bound to Jon by an unspoken loyalty that transcended the complicated webs of men. Ghost gazed at him with eyes of burning red, and Jon felt a lump in his throat. He remembered all the old nights, the times he had been among the free folk, the uncertain nights as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Ghost had been at his side then, and was at his side now. He ran a hand through Ghost's fur, seeking comfort where he could find it. His thoughts slipped to the wars, the way men had fought and died, the burning agony of watching lives snuffed out for petty claims. He remembered Daenerys' heartbreak, how her dream of breaking the wheel had ended in destruction. Now, ironically, Jon carried a piece of that dream forward in his own blunt, savage way. He had exiled the great houses, a measure that, if Dany had lived, might have seemed in line with her desire to break the chains of generational oppression. And yet, for all the blood that had been spilled, for all the heartbreak endured, Jon was still not certain that his path was righteous or wise. The days became weeks, then months, and the Wolf King's new order slowly entrenched itself. Small councils formed in each region, men and women who were not of noble birth, many of them chosen by local villages, some appointed directly by the king or his representatives. The king's edict demanded that these councils collect taxes, oversee local governance, and enforce a single code of law that applied equally to everyone. That code, in theory, was meant to ensure no man could claim bloodlines for special privilege. But in the deeply ingrained traditions of Westeros, new obstacles loomed. In the Reach, certain exiled heirs of houses Tyrell, Hightower, and Redwyne refused to simply vanish. Disguised smugglers brought them back across the sea, planting them in hidden enclaves or secret manors. Small folk who had remained loyal to their lords sheltered them, refusing to betray them to the crown. Word of these pockets of resistance reached King's Landing in the form of urgent dispatches from the new local administrators. Each time, the Wolf King was forced to respond with detachments of Crown's Guard or loyal soldiers to quell the unrest and root out the hidden lords. In many cases, the confrontation turned bloody, for the old lords knew the penalty for staying in Westeros was death. These clandestine battles were rarely the subject of public rumor, but in time, the king's men carried back stories of entire farmsteads burned, hidden enclaves discovered, rebellious villagers executed. Jon heard each new report as a fresh pang in his heart. More blood on his hands. Another blow to the realm's fragile stability. The Crown's Guard's captains insisted it was necessary, for the king's edict had to be enforced, or the houses would reassert themselves in time. Jon simply nodded, buried in the avalanche of administrative tasks. The more he tried to centralize justice, the more justice was lost in the labyrinth of commands. Still, for most of the small folk, those not directly involved in secret loyalties, life changed in peculiar ways. They were free from the heavy taxes once demanded by their lords, and the king's taxes were standard throughout the realm, not subject to arbitrary increases for the sake of petty wars. Roads were patrolled by the king's men, and large-scale banditry was quashed with the same methodical harshness that greeted rebellious lords. For the first time in generations, Westeros had a single, overarching set of guidelines, though they were far from perfect or universal in enforcement. Whispers spread, too, that King Jon was not living a life of luxury, but rather that he slept in a simple chamber, took his meals alone, and was rarely seen feasting or celebrating. Some of the small folk began to admire this austere life, seeing it as a man weighed by burdens, a man who had chosen to eliminate the old families for the sake of the realm. Others, especially those who chafed under heavy-handed local officials or those with ties to exiled lords, whispered that Jon Snow was but another tyrant, his king's edict merely a justification for total dominance. One starlit evening, as Jon stood upon the battlements of the Red Keep gazing at the city below, he spied a lone figure approaching from the north gate, a traveler on a weary horse, accompanied only by the occasional city watchman. The figure wore a hooded cloak, unremarkable in color. Something about this shape in the lamplight, the tilt of the rider's head, the slow, careful sway, stirred an old memory in Jon. He turned to a nearby guardsman and ordered that the traveler be brought to him. The traveler arrived in the courtyard half an hour later, escorted by a handful of the new watch. The hood fell away from the rider's face, revealing the weather-beaten visage of Tormund Giantsbane, that wildling who had once called Jon his friend. Tormund's red beard had threads of gray, his eyes still sharp with that wild glint. Disbelief flickered across his face when he saw how the Crown's Guard regarded him with suspicion, how the halls of the Red Keep lay draped in gloom. Still, he was ushered to the king's presence. Jon met him in a small chamber lit by a single brazier. For a moment, both men stared at each other, as if measuring how many miles and battles stood between them. Tormund gave a bark of a laugh and pulled Jon into a crushing hug. The Crown's Guard tensed, uncertain whether to intervene, until Jon waved them away. They spoke in low voices. Tormund spoke of how he had led the free folk back beyond the wall, how they lived now in scattered communities in the newly thawed lands, or as thawed as they ever would be. He spoke of the remnants of the Night's Watch dissolving, for there were no White Walkers left, and the realm no longer wanted watchers in black. Jon, for his part, spoke little at first. He was anxious to hear Tormund's news of the north, whether any exiled lords had tried to hide among the wildlings or in the remains of the Watch's castles. Tormund shrugged, saying he had no love for lords, exiled or not. He offered no illusions of easy living in the far north, but rather told Jon that it was peaceful, in a wild sense, free from crowns and banners. Jon closed his eyes, for a moment imagining how good that solitude must feel. But the thought was fleeting. He had pinned his entire existence to the Iron Throne, for if not him, who else would attempt to keep the realm from devouring itself? Daenerys had proven that the dream of liberation could become tyrannical madness. The lords had proven that the realm would always be consumed by war if each house could fan the embers of old grudges. Now it was his turn to prove or disprove whether a single man with absolute power might do any better. When Tormund glanced at the Crown's Guard, his lip curled. "What's all this, Jon Snow? You want to live in a cage of steel men? Thought you had enough of that in the Watch. Seems to me you'd be freer if you took off that tin crown and came north." Jon tried to smile, but it didn't come. No one else can stop it from happening all over again. The wars, the bloodshed, the backstabbing. When you left the South, it was in flames. It was only a matter of time before everyone fought for power. This was the only way. Tormund spat on the floor, ignoring the guard's glare. The only way? Doesn't seem like there's much life in these walls. Your eyes look like a man half-buried. I thought you'd take it as a victory once you saw the White Walkers destroyed. But now? The big wildling shook his head sadly. I'm no kneeler, but I understand duty. If you think this is your duty, so be it. But I came with a message. Something stirs beyond the sea. Heard it on the lips of sailors docking near Eastwatch, the same that come up the coast. They talk of the old lords, living in exile, gathering support in Essos. They plan to raise an army across the narrow sea, so they say, to come back and reclaim their birthrights. At that, Jon's shoulders sank. He had suspected as much. Exile was one thing. The memory of lost power is a formidable call to arms. He thanked Tormund for the news, promised to house him for the night, and parted with the weight of new burdens pressing on his chest. If the exiled lords were indeed gathering forces in Essos, Westeros might once again see war. The next day, Jon convened what he called the Council of the Realm, a body of men and women who had been elevated to handle administrative tasks throughout the 7, or now in name 1, kingdoms. The council members were mostly new faces, some from the middle ranks of the city, some from lesser trades in the Westerlands, a few from Dorne, a sprinkling from the Vale. They looked at Jon with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Many were unsure how to run a kingdom. Others had cunning ambitions veiled behind pledges of loyalty. Jon told them of Tormund's warning, that an invasion may be on the horizon. He demanded they find ways to fortify the coasts, to gather a navy capable of defending the realm if the exiled lords attempted a landing. He tasked them with ensuring trade was stabilized and the small folk wouldn't starve if war came again. Some of them nodded vigorously, eager to prove their loyalty. Others exchanged uneasy glances. Over the following weeks, a new impetus drove the Wolf King's realm. If the threat of internal rebellion had been a constant worry, the threat of external invasion renewed old nightmares. The king's men hastily conscripted shipbuilders and sailors, forging a navy out of the remains of the royal fleet and confiscated vessels from the deserted house fleets. In harbors from Dorne to White Harbor, ships took shape or were refitted under the White Direwolf banner. Local councils were urged to send every able-bodied man or woman who could fight to mustering grounds. The Crown's Guard numbers swelled, though discipline became a concern, for new recruits lacked the training once instilled in the old lord's retinues. Still, determination and the fear of a common threat welded them together. Jon, more than anyone, knew the precarious nature of untested armies. Yet he saw no alternative. This was the cost of his decree. If the exiled houses sought to take back their seats, they would bring foreign sellswords or armies from Essos. He had to be ready, and so the city bristled with preparation. Smithies rang with the clang of forging steel, wagons full of rations trundled in and out of the gates, and new walls and fortifications rose along the Blackwater. Tormund observed these preparations with a darkly amused expression. "I've had enough war for 2 lifetimes," he told Jon. "But if you need me, I won't run." Jon clasped Tormund's forearm with quiet gratitude. Of all the changes in Westeros, the presence of a wildling champion in the king's court was among the most unexpected. Yet to Jon, it felt somehow right, reminding him of those nights in the frozen north of battles fought side by side. In time, ravens from the ports confirmed that a fleet was indeed taking shape across the narrow sea. Whispers said a certain Lord Lannister, perhaps a cousin or bastard branch of the family, had brokered deals with the Golden Company. Another rumor placed a surviving Baratheon heir in Pentos, forging alliances with Magisters. Some said Sansa was there too, unwilling to remain silent while her northern birthright was in the hands of a brother-turned-tyrant. The swirl of rumors was impossible to verify. Jon spent long hours in the map room with his new master of ships, a grim-faced woman named Leona who had once captained a smuggler's vessel off the coast of Lys. Together they discussed tides, potential landing points, how best to station the freshly assembled navy to intercept or at least delay any invasion. Leona was shrewd enough to know how precarious their situation was. They had a fraction of the experience and expertise once boasted by the older lineages. But if the Wolf King demanded readiness, they would have it. Weeks stretched into months, and the tension in King's Landing began to fray. The small folk who had once hoped for a more peaceful existence found themselves conscripted into crews or forced to pay new taxes to fund the war effort. Jon had tried to keep taxes low, but the demands of building a navy and maintaining a standing army soared. Grumbling spread. The City Watch, now reorganized under the King's men, had to break up brawls and quell near riots as the strain of new levies fell on the impoverished. Jon heard these complaints daily through petitioners, through the anxious eyes of those who came to stand in the Great Hall. He tried to address them with empathy. He recalled what it was like to be poor, to be a cast-off. And yet each complaint or request for relief ground up against the immovable reality of war's looming shadow. Peace requires sacrifice, he found himself saying, though the words tasted bitter. One evening, he walked the streets of King's Landing disguised in a thick cloak, with only Ghost for company, ghostly white fur drawing frightened stares from passers-by. He heard the city folk talk about the king who had banished all the lords, how the king promised equality but now demanded arms and taxes for a war he insisted was necessary. Some still spoke of him as a hero, a man who had risked everything to destroy the White Walkers and end the tyranny of the great houses. Others cursed him as no better than the Targaryen queens or the Lannister kings, saying that with one breath he banished oppressors, with the next he robbed them for the crown. One old woman, stooped with age, recognized him despite his hood. Ghost gave him away, no doubt. She hobbled toward him and laid a shaking hand on his arm. "King," she whispered, "I was never a lady, never highborn, but I served House Rosby all my life. They were cruel at times, but they fed me in my age. You took them away. Now the crown says I must fend for myself, or rely on your new council. But the councilman here is a crueler bastard than my old lord." She shook her head sadly. "You took them away, but who's left to remember me? Where is the justice for the small folk now?" Jon's throat tightened. He tried to reassure her that the system would improve, that the crown's men would handle corruption, that the transformation would bring fairness eventually. But the woman only stared at him with hollow eyes. She hobbled off into the darkness, leaving him feeling colder than a winter night. He returned to the Red Keep weighed by the realization that the realm could not simply be commanded into a new shape. The old houses were gone, but the old scars remained, and new ones were forming. Some part of him wanted to abandon it all, to sail away with Ghost, to recede into the quiet of the north. But when he imagined the carnage that would follow, the exiled lords returning, the small folk caught between revenge-seeking armies, he steeled himself. He refused to repeat the mistakes of men like Stannis or leaders like Daenerys, who overcame adversity only to succumb to their own rigid sense of destiny. Yet, ironically, Jon was forced to cling to his own rigid path, or the realm would splinter. Then the day came when the watchers on Dragonstone signaled that sails had been spotted on the horizon. Swift ships raced to the capital to confirm it. An armada too numerous to be pirate rabble heading west. They bore no clear sigils, for the old houses were forced to hide behind new flags. But the watchers recognized the disciplined shape of troops on the decks. Some carried the faint glint of golden harps on their banners. Perhaps the Golden Company, infamous across Essos for their loyalty to gold and rumored Targaryen pretenders. Jon stood on the ramparts of King's Landing, scanning the distant sea. It was dusk, the sun turning the water bloody red. The king's new navy was assembled in Blackwater Bay, a patchwork of ships from different builders, flying the direwolf banner. Jon prayed that the months of frantic preparation would suffice. He thought of how many men and women would die if this turned into a full-scale invasion, how the city might once again be consumed by chaos. The memory of the sack and the burning from years ago still echoed in the half-rebuilt streets. He rode down to the harbor with Tormund and a contingent of Crown's Guard. The harbor was a maelstrom of activity. Crates of supplies being hustled onto the waiting ships, last-minute recruits rushing aboard. The stench of fear and brine mingled in the air. Jon conferred with Leona, master of ships, who gave him a nod, grim but ready. Then, mustering as much strength as he could, Jon addressed the sailors and soldiers gathered. He spoke of defending their home from an invading force. He told them the realm no longer belonged to lords and ladies, but to everyone who called Westeros home. He reminded them of the horrors the continent had endured. "We have a chance," he said, voice carrying over the wind, "to defend what we've built, to stand for a realm that belongs to us all, not to a few who cling to ancient names." A ragged cheer rose up. Some felt the fire of his words, remembering the brutal final battles of the last war. Others merely mustered a half-hearted shout, uncertain if the Wolf King truly offered hope or if he was merely another rung in a never-ending chain of rulers. Still, the men and women departed on their ships, setting sail to meet the approaching armada at sea, or at least halt it before it could land. Jon remained at the city, dividing his time between the Red Keep and the walls, readying defenses in case the naval engagement failed. Hours stretched into days. Ravens came sporadically from the fleet, describing sightings of the enemy on the horizon. The tension gripped every corner of King's Landing. People huddled behind locked doors, or prayed to the Seven, or the Old Gods, or the Red God. Anything that might spare them from another cataclysm. Then, amid the uncertainty, a single ship from Jon's navy limped back to port, bearing news of a terrible battle. The enemy's numbers were greater than expected, and with them sailed sails from Tyrosh, Myr, and Lys. Even though the Wolf King's navy fought valiantly, they were overwhelmed by the disciplined might of the Golden Company's mercenaries and the cunning maritime skills of the exiled Westerosi lords. The Wolf King's ships had scattered, some taken, some sunk, others forced to flee. The greatest blow, according to the battered survivors, was that many of the king's new recruits had never fought at sea, and their inexperience had told. The battered ship's captain, an older woman by the name of Glady, fell to her knees in front of Jon, tears streaming down her face as she recounted the chaos. She spoke of Leona, master of ships, fighting to the end on her deck, arrow after arrow bristling from her sail. She described how the enemy overcame them in a barrage of fire and steel. Then she told Jon the final horror. The enemy armada was now sailing for King's Landing, unstoppable. Jon closed his eyes against the surge of despair. The city was not prepared for a siege by sea. He had pinned his hopes on meeting the threat in open waters. Now he realized that, soon, all the heartbreak of war would unfold again. Yet, this time it would be unleashed by men and women he had banished. Some of them were possibly old friends or distant kin, bent on reclaiming what they believed was theirs by right. He spent the rest of that night pacing the Red Keep, dispatching ravens to every corner of the realm, demanding reinforcements, urging the local councils to send soldiers to bolster King's Landing. The Crown's Guard, now numbering in the thousands, drilled in the streets. Civilians were told to prepare for a siege, to gather what provisions they had. Some tried to flee, clogging the roads leading out of the city, but rumors spread that the Wolf King's men had locked down many gates to prevent desertion on a massive scale. Dawn broke over a city trembling with dread. From the towers, watchers spied the first silhouettes of tall masts on the horizon. The enemy fleet advanced, brazenly sailing toward the city's harbor. Banners of black and gold, red and orange, flickered in the distance. Jon donned his armor, forged from plain steel but emblazoned with the direwolf on the breast. Ghost prowled beside him as he marched to the city walls that overlooked Blackwater Bay. Beside him, Tormund Giantsbane carried a massive axe, scowling at the approaching ships. "I've seen worse," Tormund grumbled, though he could not hide the worry etched in his eyes. Jon peered through a far-eye lens. He glimpsed the prows of the enemy ships cutting through the water, their deck bristling with crossbowmen and men-at-arms. He saw catapults and scorpions mounted on some vessels, ready to unleash flaming projectiles upon the city. One large galleon in the center flew a golden banner with a faint sigil, possibly the Golden Company's. But another banner flickered in the wind, white and black. Jon's chest constricted when he realized it was the Mockingbird sigil, Peter Baelish's old device, though Baelish was dead. Then, a third banner, bearing the Baratheon stag, black on gold, waved among the fleet. He could almost laugh at the irony. The houses had returned, united under a single cause, restoring the old order. Perhaps not the same figureheads, but exiled heirs, bastards, or distant kin, all with a claim to the lineages that once ruled. They likely told themselves they were returning home in triumph, that they would free the realm from the Wolf King's tyranny, that they would restore a natural order. The city's defenders readied the catapults placed behind the walls, those that had been hastily constructed from salvaged materials. Archers lined the parapets. A hush settled over King's Landing, broken only by the lapping of waves and the occasional creak of wood from the ships. As the sun climbed higher, a single small boat emerged from the enemy fleet, carrying what looked like a party of negotiators under a white flag. Jon ascended to the battlements along the waterfront to meet them, while a handful of Crown's Guard followed. The boat drew closer, and from it stepped two figures onto the narrow quay outside the city gate. One was a knight in battered armor, face obscured by a visor. The other was a woman with auburn hair, her posture regal despite wearing no crown or sigil. Jon's heart pounded. It was Sansa. She had returned. He ordered the gate open just enough for them to step inside. At the threshold, Crown's Guard men leveled spears warily, but Jon waved them back. He stood a few yards away, memories rushing over him. She looked tired, thinner, as if the journey had taken a toll, but her eyes still held that fierce intelligence. Sansa bowed her head, just enough to be polite. "Hello, Jon," she said. No other words came, for an unspoken sea of emotion swirled in the silence. The knight at her side removed his visor, revealing Gendry Baratheon, a man once recognized by King Daenerys as the legitimate Lord of Storm's End, though that title meant nothing after Jon's decree. Gendry's features were hard, shaped by disappointment and betrayal. Jon swallowed. "Why are you here?" he asked, though he suspected the answer. Sansa's voice trembled slightly. "We came to give you one last chance to end this without bloodshed. Lift your decree. Allow the houses to return peacefully. We can work together to find a better way, brother." Jon's gaze drifted to the parted gate, where beyond it the city's defenders stood in tense ranks, and beyond them the fleet waited, bristling with arms. "Is that what you truly want?" he asked quietly. "Or do you come with an army to take back your seat by force?" Sansa flinched. "The seat was ours before you were king. The North was ours. Winterfell was my birthright. You cast it aside as though you alone could shoulder the future. We warned you. Tyrion warned you. Davos warned you. This was never going to bring peace." Her eyes brimmed with tears she refused to let fall. "Please, Jon, end it now. Otherwise, you'll be forced to watch the city burn again." Jon remembered the last time he had walked among these charred ruins. The smell of ash and burned flesh was seared into his memory. He closed his eyes, wanting nothing more than to yield, to kneel, to let someone else untangle this mess. But he felt the eyes of his men on him, men who believed in him, men who had sacrificed at his command. He remembered the old cruelty of houses. Even his own father, Ned Stark, had died by the decree of a king who was manipulated by a petty queen and cunning courtiers. House alliances had led to the Red Wedding, to the sack of King's Landing, to the War of the Five Kings, to countless atrocities. The burden of that knowledge would not allow him to relent. He shook his head. "If the houses return, the cycle starts anew. I banished them to save the realm from endless war. Let it stand. Please, Sansa, take your armies and go in peace. I won't pursue you, but I cannot restore your titles, and I will not let you lay claim to the realm." Gendry glowered, stepping forward, but Sansa laid a gentle hand on his arm. "You would rather see the city burn than yield," she said softly, as though she scarcely recognized the man before her. Jon's voice caught in his throat, but he spoke anyway. "I would rather see a free realm than kneel to old bloodlines. If you call that tyranny, so be it." Sansa stood rooted in place, searching Jon's face for any hint of the brother she had known. The sadness in her eyes cut him deeper than any blade. Gendry finally broke the silence. "We have more men, more ships. Surrender now, or we will take back what is ours by force." A flicker of sorrow passed over Jon's features. "I won't surrender. For what it's worth, Gendry. I had hoped we could find another way." Sansa bowed her head one last time, though this was no gesture of submission. She turned away, and Gendry followed, their forms soon disappearing into the boat that rowed back to the waiting fleet. The watchers on the walls remained silent, every breath taut with dread. By midday, the first flaming projectiles soared through the sky, crashing against the outer defenses of King's Landing. The siege began. The city's catapults responded, hurling stones and flaming pitch at the approaching ships, with many missing their mark, some smashing into the harbor's waters. The thunder of impact rattled windows throughout the city. Jon directed the defense from the walls, crossing from one vantage point to another, barking orders to archers and catapult crews, urging them to keep the attacking vessels at bay. But the enemy was organized. They kept the largest war galleys safely out of range, launching fire barrels into the bay to sow confusion among the defenders. Smaller craft advanced methodically, pelting the walls with scorpion bolts. Fires broke out in the dock district. Columns of black smoke spiraled upward as warehouses and wooden piers caught flame. Civilians screamed and scrambled to escape, only to find the city gates locked to prevent infiltration from the outside. The confusion mounted, and Jon cursed the necessity that made him tighten the city's defenses. From the ramparts, Tormund bellowed orders, trying to keep the archers disciplined. But it was not enough. One by one, large sections of the dock fell to the attackers, who landed small grew. PS of heavily armed men behind cover of burning wreckage. Soon, the Wolf King's defenders found themselves locked in fierce street combat. Shouts, clashing steel, and the smell of burning pitch pervaded the air. Jon realized that, if the outer harbor fell, the attackers would establish a foothold and bring in more troops. He saw no choice but to lead a counterattack personally. Donning a simple helm over his dark hair, he mounted a horse, brandished Longclaw, still in his possession after all these years, and led a detachment of Crown's Guard down the twisting city streets, heading for the thick of the fight. Ghost bounded at his side, snarling. The carnage that greeted them along the dockside was horrifying. The water was choked with debris and floating corpses. The charred remains of ships smoldered on the shoreline. Enemy mercenaries and exiled Westerosi knights pressed forward, cutting down any who resisted. Jon's arrival bolstered the defenders. A surge of loyalty spurred them onward as they clashed with the invaders in brutal melee. Longclaw flashed in the afternoon sun, cutting through armor and steel. Jon fought with the lethal grace he had learned beyond the wall and in the wars against both the living and the dead. At one point, he found himself crossing blades with a knight who bore no sigil, but whose posture and skill screamed highborn training. The knight's eyes met Jon's through the slits of his helm, brimming with hatred. "Traitor!" the knight hissed, in a voice that might have once uttered oaths of fealty in a hall of old. Their swords met in a shower of sparks. The knight lunged, and Jon narrowly parried, trying to ignore the swirl of screams around them. A roar cut through the chaos as Tormund swept in with his axe, barreling into a group of mercenaries who tried to flank Jon. The dock groaned beneath the weight of so many fighters. Flames licked at the edges of wooden posts. Arrows whistled overhead. Somewhere, a child screamed, lost in the madness. Jon forced himself to focus on the duel, stepping inside the knight's guard. With a twist of Longclaw, he disarmed the attacker, sending the knight's sword skittering across the planks. The knight dropped to one knee, raising a dagger in desperation. Jon slashed downward, cleaving the dagger from the knight's grip and cutting a deep gash in the armor. The knight slumped, mortally wounded, eyes wide with uncomprehending fury. For a heartbeat, Jon paused, staring into the face of a man who had come to reclaim what he believed rightfully his. He heard a shout from Tormund, "Jon! More coming!" And indeed, fresh waves of enemy troops landed from small boats, surging forward. The Wolf King and his men were forced to pull back to the next line of defenses. As the sun sank lower, the city's defenders managed to contain the enemy at the burning docks, though they could not dislodge them entirely. Thunderous explosions rang out as the enemy used siege weapons to blast openings in the old walls. Night fell under a sky illuminated by fire and peppered with drifting ash. Jon regrouped with his battered forces in the city's central squares, establishing lines of barricades. Civilians cowered inside houses, shuttering windows, or hid in cellars. For many, the memories of dragons raining fire upon them were still fresh. Now they watched men reenact a different brand of devastation. Jon's armor was dented and stained with blood, soot smeared across his face. Ghost limped slightly, a minor wound on his flank. Yet the direwolf refused to leave Jon's side. Tormund's beard was singed, but his eyes were fierce. "They're pinned down at the docks, but that won't hold for long," he reported. "They've got more men, more ships." Jon nodded grimly. "We'll keep them contained. If we can't repel them at sea, we'll bleed them in the streets until reinforcements arrive." Deep inside, he wondered if reinforcements would come at all. Most of the realm was scattered. Who knew if the new councils could muster enough men in time, or if they'd even bother to fight for a king who had left them uncertain about their future. Midnight came and went, with sporadic clashes along the barricades. Archers traded arrows, each side testing the other's defenses. Fires continued to burn, turning the dock district into a nightmare of dancing shadows. Jon snatched a few moments of rest in an alleyway, leaning against a cold stone wall. His mind drifted to Sansa's plea. If he had yielded, could this have been avoided? Or would it have only postponed the inevitable? He thought of the old woman he had encountered on his lonely walk, lamenting the new official's corruption. Was it truly any better than before? He felt the creeping weight of regret. Yet, with the next breath, he remembered the atrocities the lords had visited on one another. He remembered the systematic betrayals that had cost thousands of lives, the broken promises after the White Walkers were defeated. No, he told himself, the great houses returning wouldn't guarantee harmony. It would guarantee a return to the old patterns of tyranny. Dawn's light broke over a city half-shrouded in smoke. A lull in the fighting allowed each side to assess the damage. Jon climbed a rickety tower in the city's southern quarter to spy on the docks. There, he saw the enemy's tents hastily erected, their banners fluttering, some old, some new. At the forefront, he recognized a black stag on gold, the Baratheon sigil from Gendry's line. Next to it, a pale banner with a faint mockingbird, presumably some child of Baelish or a group claiming his cunning. He turned his gaze across the bay. Further out, an imposing war galley drifted. On its top deck, he spotted a swirl of red hair that could only be Sansa. She was conferring with a group of armored figures, perhaps planning the next assault. His sister was an exile in her own homeland, forced to lead an invasion because of his decree. The anguish twisted in Jon's heart. Ghost growled softly, sensing the tension. Hours passed. Another wave of attacks began around midday, with the enemy advancing from the docks, using siege towers and rams to break through the city's improvised defenses. The fighting was brutal and close quarters. It spilled into narrow streets, alleyways, squares. The Wolf King's men fought desperately, while Tormund bellowed war cries that reverberated off the stone walls. Crown's Guard clashed with Golden Company sellswords and exiled knights. The smell of blood, sweat, and despair choked the air. Jon moved from barricade to barricade, ensuring his men stayed firm. Ghost lunged at any foe who strayed too close, tearing them down with vicious efficiency. For every soldier of the Wolf King that fell, it seemed another from the other side collapsed. Bodies littered the cobblestones, and the city's gutters ran red. By late afternoon, the enemy had gained ground, pushing into several city squares, setting more buildings alight. Jon realized that without reinforcements, King's Landing would eventually fall. He rallied his defenders, ordering them to withdraw to the inner wards near the Red Keep for a last stand. Civilians fled alongside them, weeping. The heartbreak was palpable. Just a few years past, the city had nearly been destroyed under Dragonfire. Now it was threatened by an invasion spurred by the exiled nobility. Smoke drifted into the Great Hall, where Jon established a command post. The Iron Throne gleamed ominously. Jon realized how bitterly ironic it was that so many had died for that seat, that men had flayed, burned, starved, and betrayed each other for centuries to claim it. Even he had once told Daenerys he wanted no part of it. Now here he stood, sword in hand, preparing to defend it. Late that evening, one of the Crown's guard rushed into the hall, battered and out of breath. "Your Grace, the enemy has called for Parley. They're outside the Gate of the Gods. They have hostages from among the city's folk, and they say they'll kill them unless we meet." Jon cursed under his breath. The Gate of the Gods was one of the main entrances on the northern side of the city. If the exiled lords had managed to circle around with a portion of their force, they could attempt to breach it. Taking hostages among the small folk was a tactic that spoke of desperation or cunning. Either way, Jon had little choice. He ordered a small retinue to accompany him. Tormund came along, scowling at the notion of negotiation, but loyal. They wound their way through half-ruined streets until they reached the gate, where they climbed onto the walls. Below, in a churned expanse of muddy ground, stood a cluster of enemy soldiers. Sansa was there along with Gendry. Torches illuminated a group of ragged townspeople bound and on their knees. The enemy's archers stood at the ready, aiming at them. "Jon," Sansa called, her voice carrying in the smoky air. "Enough blood has been spilled. Your men can't hold the city much longer. Yield, and I swear we'll release these people. We will show mercy." Jon's grip on the battlements tightened. He surveyed the hostages, children among them, trembling in the chill of approaching night. He could see the flicker of tears on so many faces. This is how wars are fought, he reminded himself grimly, with cruelty and desperation. He forced his voice to carry. "You come with an army of sellswords and exiled lords. How can I trust your mercy? Let the small folk go. They have no part in our fight." Sansa's gaze flicked to the trembling captives. "They have every part in this fight, Jon, because you've forced them into a kingdom that denies them the structure they once had. You think you've saved them from tyranny, but you've locked them into a city that's burning. Please lay down your arms. Yield the throne. Let us rebuild in a better way." He glanced at Tormund, whose expression was a storm of conflicted emotion. The wildling had no love for petty tactics, but there were children below. Surrender might save them, but what would it mean for Jon's entire vision of a realm without lords? If the exiled houses retook power, the dream would collapse. Or perhaps that dream was already lying in ashes, given how the realm bled. He swallowed, his heart pounding, searching for an alternative. "Release the hostages first," he demanded. "Then we can talk." Gendry shouted up, "We talk now, Snow, not after." Sansa's voice trembled. "Don't make me give the order, Jon. For the sake of the realm, for the sake of these innocent people, step down." Time stretched like a blade's edge. Jon glanced out at the darkness beyond the gate, at the bright line of torches revealing only a fraction of the invaders. He could sense the presence of unseen archers, swordsmen. The city behind him was battered, fires still smoldering. His own men were exhausted and outnumbered, pinned to a last defensive perimeter. Reinforcements might never come, but something in him refused to yield. Perhaps it was pride, or the memory of every sacrifice that had led him to claim the throne. Perhaps it was the fervent hope that a realm freed from noble lines could one day find true peace. He could not let the dream die for nothing. "Jaw set," Jon called back. "No." A hush fell. Even Tormund seemed stunned. Sansa squeezed her eyes shut in an expression of deep sorrow. Then she nodded to Gendry, who clenched his jaw. The man stepped forward and, with a wave of his hand, commanded the archers to loose their arrows into the line of hostages. The screams tore at Jon's soul. He shouted a denial, voice cracking, as the small folk collapsed in the mud, pierced by a hail of arrows. The horror was immediate, final. Some tried to crawl, others slumped lifeless. Torches flickered, revealing the heartbreak etched in Sansa's face. Jon felt Tormund's hand grip his shoulder, possibly to steady him. Rage welled up, a black tide. He roared, Fire! To the archers on the wall, who unleashed arrows into the cluster of enemy soldiers below. The night exploded in blood and screams. Soldiers fell pitched to the ground. Jon could no longer see Sansa or Gendry in the chaos, but the swirl of movement suggested they had retreated into the gloom. Tormund spat. "Gods, Jon Snow, this is no war. This is butchery." Jon's hands shook on the stone. He blinked back tears, knowing that in refusing to surrender, he had condemned those innocents to die. He wanted to retch, to tear off his armor and run from the carnage. Instead, he forced himself to stand, though he felt unsteady. "We hold, Tormund. Gather any men we have left. This ends tonight." Tormund stared, uncertain if Jon meant a final stand or some last attempt at negotiation. But the wildling turned away, bellowing orders. The city's defenders lined up along the gate walls, bracing for another assault. Below, enemy soldiers pulled back, leaving the bodies of the hostages in the mud. From a vantage point on the ramparts, Jon gazed out at the swirl of torches as the enemy regrouped. He felt hollow, as though some essential part of his soul had been consumed by the monstrous demands of war. If he had any illusions of a clean fight, they were gone. Then, a new wave of torches emerged from the North Road, beyond the besieging forces, thousands of them. For a moment, Jon feared it was an additional enemy host, but soon the cry went up from watchers on the wall. "Riders! Riders bearing the direwolf banner." He stared, heart pounding. Could it be that the local councils had managed to send reinforcements after all? A ragged cheer rose from the Wolf King's defenders. The tide might yet turn. Within the hour, the new arrivals engaged the besiegers from behind, crashing into their ranks with wild fury. The exiled lords found themselves fighting on two fronts. Torches bobbed and danced in the darkness, illuminating a swirl of chaos. Shouts of fear and pain reverberated across the plain. Sensing the sudden shift, Tormund led a sally out the gate with a contingent of Crown's Guard, hoping to link up with the reinforcements. Jon watched from the ramparts as the two forces collided with a thunderous roar. The gate's defenders poured out. The exiled army pivoted, dividing their strength. Arrows whistled back and forth. The swirl of shadows revealed glimpses of men falling from horses, swords gleaming in torchlight, the metallic ring of steel on steel. Jon gripped the hilt of Longclaw, mind racing. If this new host was large enough, they could shatter the besiegers. If not, this would only prolong the slaughter. With a resolute breath, Jon descended from the walls and strode into the courtyard. Ghost followed, limping only slightly. Jon mounted a waiting horse, ignoring the knot in his gut. He would not stand by while men fought and died. He would lead for better or worse. Spurring his horse forward, he galloped out the gate, followed by a wave of the Wolf King's men. The field was mud and churned earth, slick with blood. The stench was unbearable. Flickering torchlight revealed frantic melee. Jon saw men in the front line of the new arrivals wearing rough leathers, some in piecemeal armor, carrying the stark white direwolf banner. They must be from the north or the Riverlands, folk who believed in Jon's cause. He cut down two mercenaries who lunged for him, feeling the jolt of steel biting flesh. His senses narrowed to the immediate swirl of combat. The push from behind caught the besiegers off guard, and soon Tormund's flanking charge hammered them. Lines of exiled knights buckled. Jon pressed onward, searching the chaos for any sign of Sansa or Gendry. He glimpsed a standard with the Black Stag further ahead, near a cluster of Golden Company pikemen forming a rearguard. He fought his way toward them, splattering mud and blood at every step. The ring of steel pounded in his ears. Somewhere, an enemy catapult hurled a flaming projectile overhead, igniting a patch of ground. Horses reared, men screamed, chaos devoured reason. At last, Jon broke through to a small clearing in the madness. There stood Gendry, helmet off, sword in hand, his face twisted in determination. Around him lay half a dozen fallen Crown's Guard. Behind Gendry stood a handful of Baratheon loyalists, or men who claimed to be, brandishing the Black Stag on their shields. Jon dismounted, the horse too skittish to remain in the thick of the fight. Ghost appeared at his side, hackles raised. Gendry met Jon's gaze, breath ragged. "It didn't have to be like this," he said, voice catching. "You forced me to become what I never wanted to be, a lord, a warrior. If only you had let us rebuild in peace." Jon swallowed. "I banished the houses to protect the realm from the old divisions. I never wanted war either, Gendry." Gendry gave a bitter laugh. "My father was King Robert, who took the throne by war. I was named his son only at the end. I never sought power, but I can't stand aside when the realm is ruled by fear and hammered by your absolute decree." They circled each other, weapons drawn. Ghost snarled, but Jon motioned for the direwolf to hold back. This was a matter they might need to settle themselves. Blades glinted in torchlight. The roars of battle thundered around them, but in that small ring, time seemed to slow. Gendry struck first, a powerful overhead blow that Jon sidestepped. Jon countered, Longclaw singing as it slashed across Gendry's side. The Baratheon barely parried in time, sparks flying. They exchanged furious blows, each honed by years of fighting. Jon had the lighter blade and more agile footwork. Gendry had the advantage of raw strength. A glancing strike caught Jon's left pauldron, denting the steel. He grunted, feeling the impact rattle his arm. He pivoted, slashing low. Gendry parried again, but the momentum staggered him. With a desperate snarl, Gendry lunged, forcing Jon to dodge and stumble in the mud. For a heartbeat, Jon's footing slipped, and Gendry's sword nearly came down on his head. Ghost leapt in, snapping at Gendry's sword arm. Gendry twisted aside, cursing, but the distraction let Jon regain his feet. With a swift maneuver, Jon slammed Longclaw against Gendry's blade, leveraging an opening. He felt a jolt of regret even as he twisted the hilt and drove the pommel into Gendry's jaw. The man reeled, blood spraying from his lip. Jon stepped forward, raising Longclaw for a finishing blow, but a piercing scream shattered his focus. "Stop!" Sansa emerged from the swirl of combat, face streaked with ash and tears. She shoved herself between Jon's raised sword and Gendry, arms outstretched. "Please, Jon, no more." Jon panted, sweat and blood trickling down his temple. Gendry knelt behind Sansa, wiping blood from his mouth. Around them, fighting still raged, but many paused to stare. Even Tormund, fighting a group of Golden Company men a few yards away, glanced over, uncertain. Jon's eyes locked onto Sansa's. In them he saw heartbreak, anger, sorrow, and above all, a plea for mercy. Then he glanced at the battered field, the bodies of the dead. Innocents, soldiers, men, women, even children. He looked at Gendry's defiant gaze, at Tormund's tired face, at the flickering fires in the distance. He saw in an instant the entire bloody tapestry that had led him here. His voice trembled. "What do you want me to do? If I let the houses return, the realm will be torn apart by old rivalries. If I refuse, we keep killing each other until nothing's left. Do you have a better answer, Sansa?" She lowered her arms, tears glimmering. "I don't, but I know what we're doing now isn't saving anyone. End the fighting, Jon. Don't let our home become a grave. Let us find a solution together." Jon stared at the mud, the blood on his sword, the memory of the hostages slaughtered. He felt the ache of every sacrifice he had demanded, the hollowness of the vow he had sworn to protect the realm. In that moment, a horn blast resonated across the field from the newly arrived northern host, a sign to halt or a triumphant cry of victory. Jon saw men from both sides lower weapons, struggling to catch their breath. The swirl of combat slowed, though not entirely. The hush was partial, uncertain, as though both armies were waiting for a single word from the Wolf King. Longclaw trembled in Jon's grip. He could order the slaughter to continue, hope that the reinforcements might carry the day. Or he could yield. But yield to what? Another war, another patchwork arrangement of lords and ladies returning to their seats. The seeds of future conflict yet to be sown? Sansa stepped closer, her voice so low only Jon could hear. "You did what you thought was right. I know your heart. But this is not the way. We cannot build something new on a foundation of endless blood. We must try another path." He thought of Ygritte, who had once whispered he knew nothing, of Daenerys, who had tried to liberate the world with fire and blood, of the vow he made to the Night's Watch that cost him his life. Every step in his journey had been paved with love, loss, and a longing for peace that slipped through his fingers like sand. Slowly, haltingly, Jon lowered Longclaw. A hush spread. The Wolf King gazed at his sister, then at Gendry. He saw beyond them the battered lines of exiled knights and the newly formed Crown's Guard, both sides marred by casualties. Tormund stood off to the side, panting, axe dripping. The torches flickered, revealing the devastation around them. In that moment, Jon Snow stood on the threshold of another decision that would shape the realm's future, and possibly break it anew. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the crown he had never wanted. All he had was a dream of a world free from the chains of lineage and tyranny. Yet here he stood, drenched in blood and heartbreak, on the cusp of losing everything or condemning the realm to more brutality. When he opened his eyes, they shone with a sadness deeper than winter. "I will end it," he whispered. "No more slaughter. Put down your arms." In the stunned silence, he raised his voice. "Crown's Guard, stand down." His words rippled through the lines of his men, hesitant, battered, a smattering of weapons lowered. On the enemy side, exiled knights and sellswords looked to Gendry or other leaders for orders. Sansa's lips parted, relief and uncertainty flooding her features. Jon turned to Gendry. "Order your men to stand down. No more killing. Not today." Gendry stared, then let out a ragged breath. He nodded. Sansa motioned frantically to her banners. The wave passed through the exiled forces, and swords gradually lowered. Men slumped to their knees, too exhausted to stand. The field stilled, save for the moans of the wounded and the crackle of distant fires. In the hush, Jon realized the next steps would be even harder. To find a solution, to salvage a realm from the ruin they had wrought. But at least for this moment, the killing had stopped. A fragile hush enveloped King's Landing, haunted by smoke and the weight of the dead. And so, at the end of that day, the Wolf King stood amid the remnants of the living and the lost, having banished all noble houses only to face their inevitable return. The cost, in blood and sorrow, was beyond measure. Yet for the first time in many moons, he found himself taking a trembling step toward a future that was neither a single, absolute decree nor a blind restoration of the past. In that tenuous twilight, Jon Snow stood surrounded by allies and enemies alike, uncertain if any new dawn could truly bring peace. Yet for all his uncertainty, one thing was clear. The crown on his head had not freed Westeros from its old wounds, and the ghosts of that error would haunt him, haunt them all long after the final sword was sheathed.